this your first time in Denmark?
It's actually not, but I only very briefly passed through Copenhagen on my way to a dear friend's wedding in Sweden quite a few years ago, and this trip is very short, so I know I will have to come back because I've heard that some of the best restaurants are to be found only a stone's throw from here.
That is true. You'll have to come back. Welcome, Natasha Hausdorff. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm really honored that you took the time to come and join our little podcast.
Joachim, thank you. Really, the pleasure is mine.
I want to discuss some of the accusations that have been made against Israel since October 7, almost before the war even began in Gaza. Accusations were made against Israel. And the first one that you hear constantly, you can't open social media, and you even have politicians also in the West repeating this accusation as if it was a fact, is the genocide accusation. Tell me a little bit about, from a legal point of view, this accusation. What's your take on it?
I think it's really important that we come to break down what genocide means in the context of international law, because it is a legal term. But first, I can fully appreciate, and I know that now even in Copenhagen there's a big campaign by Amnesty International with posters everywhere. This has really gained currency, this lie of genocide against Israel. But in that context, it's important that we recognise that it's in fact nothing new. I remember over 10 years ago, I did a long interview on a major radio programme in the UK on Nick Ferrari's breakfast show in 2014 during Sukeitan, where my counterpart in this debate was already using this obscene allegation that Israel was committing a genocide against the Palestinians. So in that context of this blood libel being nothing new, let's be clear about what genocide means in international law. This is a term that was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish jurist, and he invented this term to try and give legal terminology to the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, which was being targeted for extermination because they were Jews. This is a term that tries to encapsulate something that is considered worse than a crime against humanity, because it is the intentional eradication of a group of people. And the definition in the Convention for the crime of genocide, this is the Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, is clear that it's a group that is an ethnic, national, religious or racial group, and that the central focus of this crime is the intention to eradicate that group in whole or in part. And the acts that are listed as part of this definition, including the killing of members of that group or the creation of circumstances that make life impossible, that is all within the framework and within the context of this central element of the crime, which is this intention to eradicate the group. So in that context, what we are seeing is a form of projection. Historically, it seems the crimes that were committed against the Jewish people and against the State of Israel are those same crimes that Israel is now being accused of committing. Genocide is the latest in a long list of these legal terms being inverted and abused. Occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid. We've seen the same story across all of these terms. But what is particularly heinous in this context is that genocide is the worst crime imaginable, seeking to eradicate a people. And this isn't just what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. This is also what Hamas's principal aim has been and what it carried out on the 7th of October. Those were acts of genocide because they were targeting Jews, because they were Jews, for extermination, rape, torture, mutilation, burning babies and beheading men. This is part and parcel of the genocidal death cult that Hamas and unfortunately other Palestinian terrorist organizations also took part. And again, we're looking at this inversion and this phenomenon of projection where those Jewish victims of genocide in the Holocaust and on the 7th of October are being accused falsely of committing this very offense.
So in a legal terms, what you're saying is important is the word intention is important. What are your intentions? Like Hamas went into Israel, deliberately target civilians, executed civilians, and so forth. They had the intention to kill civilians.
Precisely.
Now, in an armed conflict, you target the enemy.
Yes.
And the enemy in this conflict is Hamas.
And Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other Palestinian terrorist organizations
that
operating
also
in Gaza.
participated in October 7. And so when you deliberately and intentionally target your enemy, there are civilian casualties. It happens in all wars.
It is a tragic inevitability of all armed conflict, yes.
Of this war and all other wars. But how come this accusation, this genocide accusation, it gets a lot of traction? As I said, you have politicians who I believe you should be able to hold to a kind of a higher standard than the average Joe on X. But they use this legal term, but the thing is, there's not a lot of lawyers that are really speaking up on this. This situation where you have a legal term that is being used, randomly, you just say genocide. How come nobody else is speaking up?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's random at all. I think this has been carefully orchestrated. And as I indicated at the beginning of my explanation, it's not new. There is another phenomenon which is at work here, which is unfortunately a capturing of the legal academy. And we have seen this across universities for decades, which has played very strongly into this phenomenon that we are seeing, which is the weaponization of international law. So all of those terms that I set out, they're legal terms, or at least they were before they were so badly abused in this context of lawfare against the Jewish state. But your question, and I share to a certain extent your bafflement as to how it is that something so obviously false, quite apart from the fact, and some people put it in these terms, which is quite stark, if Israel wanted to commit a genocide in Gaza, it would have done so in the first week. Every element of Israel's conduct of this war has demonstrated the opposite, that it is seeking to preserve Palestinian civilians and their lives, seeking to evacuate them. It conducts targeted strikes against Hamas, even though they are using civilians as human shields. It conducts a proportionality analysis. All of this, the detail, is thrown out of the window by those that either in seeking to support Hamas or simply because they know no better, are repeating this genocide lie. But it has been facilitated by what we have witnessed across the legal academy, across politics, and this is pretty significant given where in the world we're having this conversation. This is a part of the world in which civil society organizations have almost a godlike status. There is a sacred nature to so many of the NGOs that have been at the center of propagating this blood libel against the Jews. Now, these were NGOs that were set up for good purposes, with lofty ideals and ambitions, but they have also been entirely taken over in this war of annihilation against the Jews, because everything that is being put out, these falsehoods, and when I say a modern blood libel, I'm referring to the ancient blood libel that used to be very commonly believed, that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood in religious ritual. It is here in its modern form, in this lie that Israel is targeting civilians, or that Jews are killing children for sport, or this lie that 14,000 children were facing starvation in 48 hours that got around the world before the truth had the chance to get its pants on. All of this is feeding into the success of terrorist organizations, internationally prescribed terrorist organizations like Hamas, being able to continue to wage this war of annihilation against Israel, using Palestinian civilians as their pawns to do so. So in this appalling inversion of reality and of law, of the facts, it is a desperate state of affairs that these organizations, civil society organizations that once served these lofty ideals have in fact been weaponized to prolong this conflict, to support terrorist organizations, to promote blood libels against the Jewish state. And the people that are truly suffering, apart from the Israelis in this case, are the Palestinians. Palestinians that I would just add have been uniquely forced to remain in a war zone for over a year and a half In no other situation in the world, in history, has something like that manifested. But this is something that these organizations have given their endorsement to by claiming that allowing Palestinians to flee would in some way contravene international law. Another nonsense.
In all other conflicts, focus would be on getting civilians out of the war zone. You see that in Ukraine, but somehow there's no willingness for any Arab countries to temporarily host any refugees from Gaza.
There's even a simpler solution than that, and I was calling for this from October 2023. Egypt has obligations under international law that it signed itself up to under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it acceded to in 1980. Since then, it has an obligation to civilians fleeing civil disorder, which is a much broader definition than the definition in the International Convention, an obligation to open that border in October 2023, when civil disorder descended upon Gaza, to allow a safe haven to these civilians fleeing. And when you think about what provisions might have been made for these civilians, the other side of the border, in Egyptian Rafah, which is an enormous open space, to set up a humanitarian zone there, away from Hamas, where these civilians could have been provided for with international assistance, aid, medical assistance, without diversion by Hamas. And where Hamas would not have been able to use the humanitarian zones that Israel has set up in the Gaza Strip, including Al-Mawasi, to fire upon Israeli civilians and to deprive civilians in the Gaza Strip of the aid that Israel has been facilitating into it.
One question. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about law, but if I use common sense and I look at this situation, I guess my first question would be, does international law, the rules of war, do they allow for Israel to defeat an enemy like Hamas? If you're fighting an enemy that doesn't abide by any rules of war themselves, fight in civilian clothes, hide in hospitals, in tunnels under civilian infrastructure, so forth and so forth. If you are in war with an enemy like that, does the existing rules of law that, when these rules were made, I guess you mostly thought about states fighting other states, right? Not
armies
terror
wearing a
organizations.
uniform that meet each other on the battlefield. Absolutely.
So, but under the current legal framework, can you defeat an enemy that doesn't apply that legal framework to the way they're conducting war?
Absolutely, yes. And this is actually somewhere where the law and logic actually go hand in hand.
Okay, well, that's good.
Because apart from anything else, there is an inherent right to self-defense that every state has, which is recognized under Article 51 of the UN Charter. But that is not bestowed upon a state. That is an inherent right. Some people call it God-given. What the law of armed conflict does is provide a framework to seek to regulate what is the most chaotic of any circumstance that anyone can imagine. And that framework applies rules and principles of international law that seek to mitigate civilian casualties as much as possible. But at its core, they enable a moral, law-abiding army to target the military infrastructure and forces, the combatants of the other side, even if there are civilians in the way. What the rules ultimately boil down to, I can set out 4 principles. The first is military necessity. So an army may only take those measures which are militarily necessary to advance its war aims. Now, Israel's aims have been consistent throughout this war, defeating Hamas, ensuring they can never present the threat that they did on the 7th of October, and returning the hostages. So long as action is taken that is militarily necessary, that is targeting Hamas terror infrastructure, that is seeking to release the hostages, that is lawful. The second principle is that one must distinguish between civilians and combatants. So Israel does distinguish between its own civilians and combatants. Soldiers wear uniform. But it also distinguishes on the battlefield between combatants and civilians, even in circumstances where Hamas seeks to hide behind civilians, where it does not use uniform, where ultimately one of their tactics in this war has been to fight from civilian houses dressed in civilian clothes and to leave weapons deposits within those houses so that they're walking in the street pretending to be a civilian, going into a house and shooting at Israeli soldiers. So despite these enormous challenges on distinction, because of the tactics that Hamas employs, which are entirely contrary to international law, Israel has nevertheless been maintaining that important distinction as part of this principle. The third, and this is perhaps the most misrepresented element of international law, full stop, the third principle is proportionality. Now, this does not require some macabre weighing up of casualty figures on both sides.
That's one argument you hear. It's like 1,200 Israelis died in Gaza, in Israel on October 7, and Hamas says 50,000 plus has died, and they don't count combatants. So people are saying, that there's not proportionality.
Right. Apart from the fact that that's legally illiterate, also on a moral basis, it's appalling. Right? This idea that any calculation should be made on the basis of how many civilians Hamas is willing to sacrifice. And we can come on to that 50,000 false figure in due course, because the fact that Hamas casualty figures have been parroted by the world's media is a grotesque failure of journalism and a complete absence of journalistic integrity over the last year and a half, which needs to be called out. But what proportionality says is that the commander of a military strike needs to weigh up the anticipated military advantage of that strike against the anticipated collateral damage. Now, that is an analysis that I know, and maybe you know, because I know you were in Israel a couple of weeks ago, that the IDF conducts on a strike-by-strike analysis basis, on the basis of the intelligence that it has, which, frankly, with respect to Gaza, is most of the time second to none, because of the level of investment that the Israeli intelligence services have put into knowing everything there is to know about this part of the world. But crucially, it's an assessment that can only be made on an intention basis. It is not an effects-based analysis. So if the commander is working on the basis of some false information, unfortunately, mistakes happen, it's not the effects that need to be taken into account in the context of international law. It's what the commander knew and the proportionality assessment that was made before the strike was taken. Now, just before perhaps we circle back to talk about how proportionality is being abused in the reporting, the fourth principle here is that of precaution. And that requires that reasonable precautions are taken, whatever is practicable, whatever is feasible in the context of targeting the enemy, to prevent civilian casualties. And in this respect, Israel acts in an unprecedented fashion. It takes more measures than any other army in history to prevent civilian casualties. And that's through giving warnings of strikes. Has anyone ever wondered why we have so much footage of strikes in Gaza? It's because the cameras are set up in advance, because the people know where is going to be hit, because Israel gives these warnings, which are specific often as to the buildings that are going to be targeted. These warnings are also sent via text message and phone calls to individual householders. Leaflets are dropped. And now, in the last couple of days, we've seen further evidence of Israel setting up humanitarian corridors, indicating where it will be safe for civilians to leave areas where it needs to target Hamas terror infrastructure, because this is where they've set up their command and control centers. You mentioned hospitals. They also use schools, clinics, ambulances, UN facilities, UNRWA facilities, also to hold hostages. We've heard testimony from hostages, including Emily Damari. But the point is that these precautions that are taken, and they also apply to the munitions that are chosen and to the type of tactics that Israel deploys, to the detail of how a particular building is struck, so that the direction, the angle of the impact limits the amount of debris and collateral damage that one might have as a result of this strike. So these detailed efforts that are made in terms of precaution are essentially taken together with the military necessity, with the distinction, with the proportionality, with the precaution, and they inform every individual strike that Israel takes and every military maneuver that it conducts on the ground in Gaza. One thing I will say, and it's in relation to people calling this action disproportionate, is that no one, without the information that has informed these military decisions, is able to issue any assessment on the lawfulness of Israel's conduct, because they simply do not have the information that informed when, how, why, with what munitions these strikes were taken. There are, importantly, a couple of key allies with whom Israel has shared some of this very sensitive intelligence. The US and the UK are included. And it is very important that they have consistently been clear. They do not have concerns with respect to international humanitarian law and Israel's targeting and proportionality. And so many legal experts and military experts have come out to say that other Western militaries, modern moral armies, would not be able to compete with the standard that Israel has set, which in fact goes well above what international law requires. Let's also just be clear that international law in armed conflict sets a basic standard. It's a minimum standard. Israel surpasses this in every respect. And yes, I'm afraid it is completely contrary to what you will hear from politicians in the media and increasingly, I think, on social media also.
But nevertheless, Israel is being criticized.
Falsely, in my opinion. It needs to be pushed back.
And I agree with that to a degree where I'm thinking that, like, it's very sympathetic that you warn of a strike ahead, give civilians a chance to clear the area, but don't you risk, I mean, Hamas gets that message too, right?
It does.
Don't you, like, risk prolonging the war by saying where you're going to strike in advance?
Absolutely. And I imagine that's one of the reasons that progress has been so slow. Let's be clear, progress has been made over the last year and a half, not just against Hamas, but also against Hezbollah. But part of the shift, it seems to me, in public opinion now, seems to be on the basis of how long this operation has taken, Operation Iron Swords, as Israel has called it. Even the United Kingdom and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, coming out, enough is enough now. It's gone on long enough. Put a stop to it. Which is bizarre and certainly counterintuitive in terms of the very slow methodological manner in which Israel has progressed here in order to try and prevent civilian casualties. It's entirely out of touch with that and the realities on the ground. But I would just also highlight that these measures are taken despite the inevitable consequences and the military casualties that Israel has suffered. This is an army that is a conscription army. And so every casualty is felt in Israel by the nation in a way that I just don't think resonates quite in the same way in other countries. And despite that, this high standard has been maintained, despite the cost in blood that Israel has paid through taking these extraordinary measures to protect Palestinian civilians. It continues to keep to those incredibly high, unparalleled, unprecedented standards. There
are two more. We could speak for a long time, but there's two more things just I need to hear your comments on. Right now, it's the discussion of aid. Like, Israel has ceased with bringing in aid to Gaza. You have this whole, you mentioned the story with the 14,000 babies that were supposedly going to die within 48 hours.
And that was walked back, but unfortunately far too late.
Yeah, I know. I called it out on X. It's not going to happen. It was so obviously false, and it turned out to be false. But this cutting off aid in a legal framework, can you elaborate on that?
Just before I do, and talking about what international law requires is really critical, I do want to take issue with this notion of cutting off aid.
Yeah, but that is, yeah. What I'm doing is...
I'm not arguing with you.
No.
I want to set the record straight.
This is the narrative out there, right?
Yes, of course, absolutely. And it's so important to have the opportunity to address it because it's false. Mm-hmm. Yes, aid stopped going in after the ceasefire. But across that 2-month ceasefire, over 25,000 lorries, I believe. Let me just double check the figures. That's why I brought the laptop with me. Across that, yes, 25,200 aid trucks carrying 447,538 tons of aid entered during the hostage release deal. So the estimates as to how long that aid should have lasted are between 5 to 6 months. We're 2.5 months out from the end of that deal when aid stopped going in. Joachim, what's happened to all that aid?
Yeah.
Now, Israel has now, over the last few days, started to release aid in again. But the notion that 6 months of aid can disappear in less than 2.5 should be raising questions in the international community.
And this is recorded. It's recorded how
it's
much
all on
aid...
the COGAT.
Yes.
I'm reading this off
Yes.
of the COGAT
Yes.
website, so I can tell you that as a total, across the war, 1,782 tons, 948 tons has gone in terms of humanitarian assistance. Now, this is aid that Israel has facilitated into the Gaza Strip from various different sources. One of the major problems is that a lot of the international reports, the IPC report, some of the Famine Review Committee commentary, has not taken into account all of the aid that has gone in. They have decided only to look at what the UN has facilitated in or distributed, or they have ignored private sources of aid. The fact is, the authoritative source of the level of aid that has gone in is on the COGAT website. I encourage everyone to go and have a look at it.
One thing that surprised me about that, and that is the UN doesn't deny this, is that the aid that they record going into Gaza is the aid that comes in through the organizations that they work with,
which I think is less than 30% of the total aid going in.
So all and they write this. There's
in the small print.
Yeah, in the small print they write this. But so whenever you hear the UN talk about aid going in, it's only the aid that they are somehow connected to through their partners.
In other words, it's a lie when they present it as though it's the total aid that is
but
going
it's
in.
like one of those things where I also think journalism has failed.
Right.
But it's like of course, it is true that aid is going in, but the impression that is made is that it's the only aid going into Israel. That's what is reported in the media, but in fact, it is not. There are many other organizations that bring in aid that are not through the UN. They're not affiliated with the UN.
So I appreciate that these numbers, and I should explain that COGAT is the unit of the Israeli Defense Forces whose sole responsibility is the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in armed conflict. And so they are the authority on the levels of aid that is going in. But these numbers, frankly, they don't mean that much to me. They might not mean that much to you. There was a study that was conducted last year by a group of academics, including nutritionists, that didn't just look at the volume of aid, but also the nutritional content. What was going in over a period of 7 months, from January to July last year. And they determined that an average of over 3,000 calories per person per day was going in. Now, that's significantly in excess of the NHS guidelines on the recommended daily calorific intake. I'm imagining there is something similar in Denmark. 3,000 calories plus a day is more than any individual needs. That is the level that was supplied across that period. And if they had time to be able to conduct studies across the rest of it, I'm sure that they would. So the disconnect, this is the big lie, and it is feeding into this lie of starvation. This idea that Israel is starving Gaza is debunked just by looking at the aid that is being facilitated into the Gaza Strip. On top of that, of course, we are seeing photographs of supposedly starving children being used to justify in the media this canard that Israel is starving Gaza. To a point, these individuals' children have been identified as very sick children that have underlying health difficulties, which is what explains their malnutrition state. One of the last ones I saw only yesterday in Sky News was a baby who was rejecting both breast milk and formula. The fact of the matter is that to a point on each of these photographs, I've seen these children with their mothers, who all appear extremely well fed. I have never encountered, Joachim, a mother who would eat before her starving child. The fact that the media would be propagating these falsehoods when just, the smallest bit of logic applied to interpret this information and apply some critical thinking to it ought to demonstrate that we are being had. And the reason this is so significant is because Jews and Israelis are being murdered in the street. They are being executed as a direct result of this false information, and this canard of starvation is the latest manifestation of it.
One observation I've made over the last few weeks, and they have nothing to do directly with the conflict in Gaza, is that you have had Finland on one side saying that they want to get out of a convention that banning the use of personal mines and cluster bombs. It's because of the threat from Putin's Russia. So now they're facing a real threat, and they're saying, okay, there are some of these rules that are preventing us from defending ourselves effectively. And in another ball game is that our own Prime Minister in Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, along with the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, now they were out this week saying that the conventions regarding immigration, refugees to Europe needs to be changed, or they need to be interpreted in a different way, because we cannot conduct the policies that our people want. So it's both examples of Western leaders facing some sort of political reality and are in conflict with the interpretation of certain international law in different areas. And the same leaders are very fast to criticize Israel when Israel is facing a threat. Israel has been attacked and is fighting a war. It's not theoretically. It's real, and that's why I also asked you about why are not more lawyers, experts on international law speaking up? Because you only hear from NGOs. Almost you are a voice, but you almost exclusively hear from these NGOs. Do you understand? Like it's kind of
well, let me be clear. I was asked to pursue a career in academia. I don't anticipate I would have gotten very far because I refused to drink the Kool-Aid on Israel. And that is an absolute requirement. People have been chased out of universities, been chased out of their careers. They've had, threats. A lot of them have shut up as a result. I am in a very privileged position in that I am an independent legal practitioner. I have my practice in London. I also have, as a responsibility, as I see it, being a barrister, professional responsibilities to uphold the rule of law, which I take very seriously, which are part and parcel of why it is that I feel compelled to speak out on these issues. But I think you're absolutely right about this hypocrisy and double standards. Isn't it interesting? And in the UK, we would say, when the chickens come home to roost, when other Western liberal democracies are facing similar threats, their perspective maybe begins to shift. Now, I have been saying for a very long time that this fight is not just Israel's fight. It is a fight against Western civilization that Israel happens to be on the front lines of. It is against our very way of life. But consistently, and this has been a matter of decades, the European attitude and approach has been to view Israel as though it had Switzerland on its border. As though it, in fact, because it is the outpost of the West, it is a Western liberal democracy in the Middle East, to misunderstand that region and to think that, in fact, Israel was dealing with reasonable neighbors that one can sit down with and negotiate with. And the sooner that the rest of the West recognizes that Israel is dealing with genocidal death cults and Iranian terror proxies that are coming for us here in the West, at the same time. It used to be, we'll finish Israel and then we'll come for the West. No, they're doing it at the same time now. We have terror plots that have just been foiled by the IRGC in London. We have the attack that was carried out in DC against the Israeli embassy staffers wasn't even carried out by an Islamist in the true sense. He was of Hispanic origin and he came from Chicago, which indicates another phenomenon here, that this war is including this unholy alliance between the extreme left and the Islamists. And it was that same alliance that spelled downfall in Iran. And so many Iranian dissidents and those who have fled are now seeking to warn the West of the consequences of this. But it's very, very interesting that I think, I hope at least to a certain extent, as people are waking up to those realities and are also recognizing the realities of what Israel is facing, and that they shouldn't have been surprised about the 7th of October. Because if you just listen to their media, the so-called moderates, the Palestinian Authority on their television call for this same war against the Jews, a genocidal annihilation of the Jews, and it needs to be internalized that we are not dealing with friendly European neighbors here.
Well, we're running out of time, but one point I would like to make too is that as a European, what worries me is that if you have politicians like criticizing Israel for the way they conduct a war. Israel has been attacked, and they criticize Israel. And what worries me about it is that, like, we are facing several threats in Europe. Both you just mentioned some of them about immigration, where some of them have a radical point of view and try to change the society and so forth. But we're also facing a threat from Russia.
Yeah.
And what I would like in my political leaders is that if we are attacked, then we win the war. And I get a little bit anxious when I hear politicians criticizing Israel for trying to legitimately, it's a legitimate war. They've been attacked, and they are fighting an enemy that wants to destroy them. And you have to be able to defeat an enemy like that.
Israel's never allowed to win a war, and I think the danger is now that Western states are going to be in a position where they're not allowed to win wars.
And that's what I mean. And that's what makes me nervous. I mean, we would never have won the Second World War. I'm not sure we could win that today. Like if there is that pretty much strength, if the politicians have that commitment and strength to defeat people who attack you.
Yeah. The difference I would probably just highlight is that for Israel, this is an existential war.
Of course.
And I don't think that's recognized by many people. On the 7th of October, there was nothing standing between where Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups got to and the rest of Israel. And if Hezbollah had joined in, the outcome may have looked very different.
Yes. It was their idea. They had the same plans of attack, the same strategy.
They publicized those plans. So in fact, one of the reasons that Hamas was able to successfully surprise Israel is because Israel expected this very attack from the north, because this is what the Radwan forces had been advertising that they were gearing up towards for a substantial amount of time. But when one recognizes this kinetic war that Israel is fighting on 7 fronts, and recognizes that it is an existential war, and that it is orchestrated in so many respects by Iran, which is posing an existential threat to Israel, then this notion of, what international opinion will have to say on whether Israel should or shouldn't defend itself becomes a lot less significant. This idea that Israel will simply throw up its arms and surrender because of concerns raised in the Danish parliament is absurd, especially when those concerns are frankly based on a misstatement of international law and a complete falsification of the facts. But wouldn't it be so much better and more encouraging if more Danes and other Europeans woke up to the realities that we are contending with before it gets to that existential point here for Denmark, and recognizes that moral, law-abiding armies can fight these death cults, these internationally prescribed terrorist organizations that use and abuse international law for their own advantages, and can do so in a way that still upholds international law and the standards that we rightly share and are proud of.
Natasha, thank you very much for coming and taking time to join us today. Det var alt for dagens Borgerlig Tabloid. Mit navn er Joachim B. Olsen, og jeg lavede dagens program sammen med journalist Maria Asmine Dam og min producer Jens Marott. Vi er tilbage på onsdag. Tak fordi I lyttede med.